Welcome back to another podcast where we help aspiring developers get jobs and junior developers grow. Today, I have with me someone I worked with actually at my last company, Catalytic. His name's Kevin. He's a fantastic. God, he. I want to call him QA, but quite frankly, like he did a hell of a lot more at that company. So, Kevin, thanks for being on. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so what kind of is your history? Like, so when I joined Catalytic, you basically you were QA. I know Catalytic kind of had its own wording for the title of the position, but that's kind of what my experience was with you. So, can you talk a little bit about like what you do at Catalytic now and maybe a little bit of your past?
Yeah, so I got hired as a QA analyst when Catalytic started up, um, and was very much into QA and um, product in general. I wanted to actually get into product management at the time,
Oh,
and QA is like a very um, good way to get into that if you're interested in product management. Um, I was previously doing QA for McDonald's for their mobile app. Um, and before that, I worked for a company that automated IT systems. Um, and so Catalytic was a great fit for me because I could um, continue improving my QA skills and also get into automation because I was into that as well. Now I'm well, I there wasn't really a good fit for me product wise. Like there wasn't a good position or there wasn't a role I could grow into immediately. Catalytic's a startup, so it's a small company. So you can only grow so big, have so many positions. And I was interested in actually using the product we were building itself.
that's
Um,
big.
I was really eager to do that. So now, like, my role is more of like a implementation engineer. So I'm using Catalytic to automate processes for our customers.
Yeah, that and kind of when I transitioned out of that company, that's definitely more in line with what you were doing. And so, just kind of for people listening, I really want to focus on, like what is QA and how, as a developer, like in relation to like working with the developer, like what is QA like? What are their expectations like? So, and kind of what you're describing is Catalytic's own form of like building out automation bots, and you really had to have a thorough understanding of the platform to be able to do that. And I remember so many times I would just get stuck, and you you were incredibly helpful. You were the guy that I usually went to, but I know. So with this talk, I kind of want to focus on like probably more of like the traditional role of QA, a little bit more of like what you started with when I started at Catalytic. Because I have tons of questions, and I know a lot of developers have tons of questions. So are you okay with that?
Yep, totally.
Awesome. So, what is QA?
Um, I see QA as being kind of the last line of defense for catching any flaws in the development cycle before it reaches customers or whoever your clients are. Um, and I just see them as just being the last people to see something before it ships out. And then they also are the ones that are driving quality, owning quality, in addition to everyone else that's involved in the product lifecycle. But they're mostly the ones that are owning quality.
Yeah. So do you feel like someone in a QA position that doesn't care about the the quality of the product can be successful in that position?
I don't. I think if you want to, if you, I think the best QA people and the people that succeed in QA are people that have empathy, because
Okay.
you had to like really empathize with who if I mean if your product sucks, then your customers are going to feel that, and you have to feel that empathy for your customers. And so I think if you want to succeed in QA, you have to have some empathy. Um, and so you have to look at whatever's coming through QA as like you're the customer. This is how I would perceive it, or um, a lot of times like products are built to be a certain way, but they might not work very well in the customer's eyes. Like if you're not looking at it through a customer's perspective, then what you're putting out and shipping out is like not going to be quality, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So having that empathy is like I think is like one of the biggest qualities or best qualities you can have as a QA.
You know, that's interesting because before Catalytic at my last company, I remember us having a lot of like UX design meetings, and I was
Mhm.
at first I was kind of curious why QA were in those meetings, and like they seemed to be the ones like really challenging the like not the happy path but like the weird scenarios, and they did a really good job of it. And I think it took me a while to realize like how important or like that mindset that you have, and you kind of just described it like empathy. That's what you need to have. Like I didn't realize QA was so focused on like the user centric, the customer side perspective of things, where I honestly I'm kind of just talking about it, but I think it's just interesting because um, I think you guys like really have to understand the psychology of your customer and like really understand the customer. And I didn't realize how much work and empathy and effort that took from you guys. So that's that's pretty cool. But you had also mentioned uh, like you have expectations of quality, right? And so now we kind of understand like why. But you also mentioned like you're not the only one, right? Everyone has certain they need to kind of hold themselves accountable for the quality that they produce. So let's actually kind of like dive into in relation to a developer. Like, what are your expectations for developers to make sure that they're producing the quality, just as much as you are?
Yeah. So in addition to following best practices, coding back, I mean, it really depends on like what product you're putting out. For like front end and back end developers, following general best practices is one thing, and owning that part of quality. There's like several levels of quality.
Mm-hmm.
There's like writing unit tests and writing end-to-end tests. Um, like that's one expectation. Like having I think that's like the bare minimum actually. Just like writing some unit tests and some end-to-end tests.
Well, I actually want to pause there because this is
Mhm.
a really good question. Do you so do you expect developers like do you think every developer should be writing unit tests and end-to-end tests?
Um, I think they should be writing if it's their code, they should be writing unit tests at least.
Okay.
Maybe not end-to-end tests. Um, there could be like it really depends on like what they're building, but I think unit tests make sense. Um, I think they would be like the most knowledgeable about like how their code works. That's my reasoning. Um,
That makes
End-to-end
sense.
tests might not be. It doesn't always have to be written by a developer. It could be QA that owns that, because they might be able to think of like more scenarios than the developer would be able to. Um, I think like writing tests in general could be like a little collaboration between QA and developers though. Because developers are like they own their code, they know how their code works, and QA is more of like they understand how features work and how features affect other parts of the product, you know. So they have like a bit more broader perspective of how your code might affect other parts the app you're building or website you're hosting. So I see developers as like they own their code and then QA owns like the whole product.
I, I really like that kind of division. Just because as a, I've worked at two companies where I didn't write a single unit test. Like before Catalytic, not a single unit test. But it was, it was pretty much equal sized companies, actually. And so I think a lot of dev teams do things a little bit differently. But, QA teams also are different at my previous two companies as well. Um, I like I like the idea of first of all, I like Catalytic's uh, mindset of write more tests, and I think that's something that had challenged me as a developer when I was coming in, and I think that was a really good practice. And it like I I don't 100% believe this is kind of just for developers. Like I don't think every feature needs to be a test driven feature, but I do think critical components do need to be tested. And I like the idea, like you said, developers know their code, they know their implementation details. So the unit test, yeah, QA should not be writing those. Like it would, you wouldn't be expected to write those. But I don't know. I think I liked Catalytic's mindset of kind of pushing a little bit more tests with that. I think that makes sense. So go on. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I mean, what we said about how organizations, like every organization is structured a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's like one very challenging thing um, in QA because you have to kind of conform to however your organization is running things, and sometimes challenge them. Um, and I mean, I when I worked for larger companies, like QA was very siloed off, so it made it very difficult. But I think if you want a higher quality end product, like collaboration between developers and QA is key to that. Like having good communication is key because developers, like I don't think developers are expected to know the ins and outs of the product. Um, but QA is expected to know that. And QA likewise is not expected to know the ins and outs of like every code that's written, you know, but they should know like what it's doing.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like you guys have a much better memory than I do. Like every time I go into a new application like Catalytic, I really didn't know how all the pieces would connect, and then to me it felt like there were a dozen ways that, or like a dozen different things that my feature would connect to that I didn't even like know about. I really had to hash that out in the requirements because it mattered, but yeah, this is just a compliment. You guys have way better memory than I do. Like
Yeah, I think that goes back to like looking at it from a user perspective. Like when I look at new features coming through, like usually a lot of organizations do this. They tie features to user stories. So, product manager, whoever's like driving the feature, will look at it and say like, how is this feature being used? And a really common method is like having user stories, like as a user, I want to use this feature because of this, and this is why we're implementing this feature. And QA like usually goes off of those user stories. So when like a new feature comes in, um, a lot of QA teams will have like user stories tied to like things to test to, you know. So if this feature is tied to a user story, then it ties to like these tests that we should look for or these scenarios we should test for. Um, and that knowledge can be shared with developers to make it a little bit easier. I know with Catalytic, we didn't do a very good job of that. Um, but there are methods where you can um, share those user stories with developers, and so they have a little bit more transparency and understanding of like how like what features would be affected and like what things to test for. Um, but yeah, it's I was just new catalytic like in and out, so that's why like I just knew everything. But like it's not a good practice to know everything. There shouldn't be one person that knows everything.
Yeah.
Like it should be a team effort. And so that if there is a person that knows everything, then that's and like not and that knowledge isn't communicated to everyone else. Like that usually indicates there's a problem. Um, so I would argue that you that like QA if QA only if it's only QA that has that knowledge, there needs to be some work put into like sharing that knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, I really agree. I love that idea. I can tell you from personal experience that that's not always the case, and I think Catalytic did a better job at sharing that kind of widespread knowledge than my previous two companies did. So where you feel like you didn't do a good job, I was delivered a lot more information than I was used to, which is great. And sure, Catalytic can improve just like any other company, but I think just a message for developers, it's very hard to know, especially when you're just coming in. It's very hard to know like how your feature really integrates into everything else. And honestly, QA, either like QA product, probably a bit of both, where like you guys really just have the knowledge to help me solidify requirements or think of like weird scenarios I didn't think of. So yeah, but I think overall Catalytic really does kind of a good job. Like you also mentioned something like communication is important. I think it's easy to say that communication is important because like everyone says it, right? Communication is important for everything. But what what does it actually look like? We kind of talked like very briefly about, and this is in a previous conversation, like having the right attitude and like what kind of things should be communicated when you are like when you are evaluating a developer's communication with you for you to do your job effectively, like what kind of things are you looking for? What are you expecting?
Yeah. So like everyone has a little bit of like their ego, like they are excited um, to push their code into production and it's good to have like ownership of your code, and so sometimes developers they see QA as like someone that just like just criticizes their code um, and they take it a little personally. And I would say like don't take any feedback personally. It's just and then again this goes back to like empathy. We're all on the same team. If there's like a flaw or something just isn't working right, it's a customer that suffers, and ultimately the business that suffers, and might be your paycheck that suffers too. Um, so I would say not don't take it personally. Um, you're all working together, um, and to work collaboratively, like like try to communicate things in a way that um, is not personal and um,
Do you can we pause here for a second?
yeah, let's pause.
No worries, no worries. Um, yeah, we could pause here and kind of let people do their own things. But that was a really good answer. Hi, by the way, whoever's in the background.
Yeah, this is Anna. This is Don.
Hey.
I worked with Don.
Hey, how's it going?
Sorry about the noise.
No,
It
that's
was
okay.
heavy.
No, he warned me about it. We knew it was coming. It's completely fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Barney like right over here. It's so
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah, there's just a cat head like poking out like in the corner of your video. I was just like I got distracted.
Yeah, I forgot that he would do that.
But fuck, I don't even know where we left off.
Yeah, we were talking about communicating between developers and QA, and I was saying not to take feedback personally, to think of it more of uh, like you're all on the same team. You're just thinking of it from the customer's perspective. Like if you like, would you really be happy if you pushed this out and customer ran into this and they have a lower opinion of your product now because they ran into this problem, and I think another assumption to have is like if something can go wrong, it will go wrong
Hmm.
100%, and so sometimes like developers like to like gloss over things and say like, oh, like that's not a big deal, or like like that's never gonna happen, and like the thing is like if it can happen, it will happen, it's just a matter of time, and it could be someone really important that runs into the problem. It could be very insignificant, like even like the most insignificant flaws could have like a big impact, um,
Yeah.
and or at least they should be weighted accordingly. But like it's also like it's not like a game. I mean, it's like, well, I should rephrase that. Like it is kind of like a game to like find like uh bugs in code and stuff. Like it is kind of
Hmm.
fun to do that, but it's like it's otherwise like people would never enjoy doing QA. Um, but it's not like something that like I'm trying to bring you down like as a person because I found flaws in your code.
Yeah, and I think that realization on your end shows your maturity in your profession as well. Because, I mean, you're right. Everyone does have their ego, and especially like a lot of newer developers, it's easier to have that ego when you're not used to like, like when I worked at my first company and QA would basically QA was honestly too kind to me. I worked with really, really good QA, and they worded everything right, and they sugar coated everything. They were really good for junior developers. But um, I did have a bit of an ego. I still do to this day, but like I can still like in the back of my mind feel like it's like a strike to the quality or the value that I can offer, and I know it's not that. Like I logically know it's not that, but it's very hard to toss that feeling completely out. I think it takes a while, and I think it takes trust being built up with QA. That again, you're not there to tell them what they're doing wrong. You're there to help them produce a quality feature. Like it
Yep.
literally is teamwork, and I think that perspective it takes a long time to really get embedded in you. And so the fact that you even realize that like there is kind of that feeling with QA, it's I think that's why it makes you so likable and easy to work with, because you have empathy for that, and the way you approach that shows. So I, yeah, I think that's really good for kind of even just QA to recognize. But developers, it very much like I think a lot of us do like want like we take pride in our code, and we take pride in the features that we build, that we can build something that does provide value to clients. It's um, so I think a lot of us do like we want to produce quality, but inherently I don't think a lot of developers, their focus of or their position or what they perceive their position to be is a focus on counting for all of those edge cases, and for it to not like to be the perfect solution for a developer. I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in here are the requirements, as long as I solve this requirement, this requirement, this requirement, this code is good to go. And so I think as a developer, and this is kind of just a piece of advice, this is where I struggled with as well. If the way that you're going to produce good quality is to have those conversations early when you're producing the requirements. And if you do, like in Catalytic, we didn't have a traditional product role where product came up with all the requirements. Catalytic was very unique, but I think in a traditional developer role, you will have a product manager that understands the product very well and kind of distributes features and works with developers to talk about like what can actually what does this feature actually look like based on implementation, um, you know requirements and like roadblocks. But I think as a developer, like really make sure that you understand every single requirement. And like I really think QA should be in on that conversation as well as product and the developer and UX. And like I think that's the most important thing is just have a solid set of requirements that everyone agrees on. Because if people are like a little bit off and like they think of a scenario in their head but they don't mention it in that meeting, like then you get floating requirements that come up and like delay projects. And like I think like my message is if anyone, QA or developers, has anything to say, like just spit it out and make sure everyone agrees on every single requirement. Because like ideally like you should have kind of like some goals or measurements of like when a developer's done, because if you don't, you actually get a lot of developers that will be perfectionists that will say this is never done. Actually, we could do this. Actually, we could do this, and this will be a really cool reusable component down the road, right? So why not, spend an extra week doing this? And I really think like if those requirements aren't very clear and agreed upon by everyone, that's when developers don't own that quality and when they're actually finished.
Yeah, I think requirements are huge or extremely important in QA as well, because like writing out test cases, most QA will take requirements and write out test cases and scenarios based on those requirements, and those requirements are like the happy path basically, and um, those are like the bare minimum that gets tested, and then QA will think of like just edge cases and weird scenarios um, off of those requirements. So knowing those early and solidifying them is really, really important. I've definitely been on projects where those requirements were not baked in stone like early on. And so toward the tail end of the development cycle, you have a QA this feature, but you aren't entirely sure if this was a requirement or not. Hugely frustrating to push out that feature, and features always have deadlines, so it's a lot of pressure on the developer and QA to like push out a feature when like those requirements are not signed.
Yeah, yeah. So I can see that affecting. I mean, yeah. At the end of the day, if those requirements aren't solidified, like you are the last stop. You're going to deliver that project right back to developers, and we have to change implementation. We have to do something different. So it really is in our best interest to like, because I think a lot of maybe you have a different opinion, but I feel like I've worked with like a lot of kind of social teams where people are good communicators, but overall, like at a lot of companies, a lot of developers are kind of quirky, sometimes a little bit awkward, and I think sometimes a little bit shy, and they don't speak up. And I want to encourage developers like it's just going to make your job easier to try to get a little bit more, find your voice. I think that was the way to put it. Like find your voice in meetings, get comfortable with the people you're working with. That'll definitely help you. So you talked about like the right attitude. You talked about, and that really came down to just not taking things personally. You're in it together. Uh, what's kind of your experience like with a developer that does take it personally? Like, how does that like play out? well, maybe like not just a developer that does take it personally, but a developer that consistently kind of just like you guys can't see eye to eye, and he's delivering features, you're constantly like you can't approve of them, you can't send them out because the quality is just not there. Like how do you, like what happens in that scenario and how do you kind of work through that?
Yeah. Well, for QA's perspective, like it's very easy to like lose your patience if but
Sure.
in those scenarios, like you have to like keep your cool and just work through it and try to communicate. And again, like communication is really important. Again, communicate that like, hey, this is like a customer that's going to see this, you know, like like a picture yourself like presenting in front of a customer your work, and then they run into this. How would you feel? Like, would you be happy if that happened? That's
Oh, I
like
like
that's
that.
how I feel when I QA stuff. Like I think of myself as like live demoing in front of the customer, and they run into this. Um, and 9 out of 10 times, like if developers care about their work, they will be like they'll be like, oh, okay, I see that. If they don't have that, then I think they have deeper problems. But if if I have worked with like more difficult developers before, and if I have to like keep on rejecting the work, like it usually means that the timeline for delivering the project is delayed a little bit, and that usually gets communicated to whoever's managing the project. Sometimes it's a product, sometimes it's a project manager, and there's usually like a stand-up meeting or an update meeting of like, hey, like, where are you with this? And like QA will be like, well, we couldn't get this through, like this is why. And again, being very impersonal, saying like, hey, this just didn't meet quality standards. Like that's how you would communicate something like that. And and then it's usually like the PM or product manager or whoever's in charge of the product owning this feature getting out that says like, okay, like let's work through this. Maybe the problem is like this developer is like overworked and they just didn't have time to um, to code for all these scenarios. Maybe like they needed additional resources. So oftentimes like when that happens, like someone else it comes in and helps a developer meet the quality standard, and like that's usually what the case is like most of the time. Like they're just a little overwhelmed or just need a little bit of help, or they're just like totally missing something and like just need someone else's perspective to like they just need some guidance. um, and if you are open to that or open to like receiving help, then you will be successful. And if you're a little bit like uh, arrogant or stubborn, like it won't help you out at all.
Yeah, I I think that's really really good advice, and like really emphasizing why is the developer not caring about the product. I want to give a couple of experiences, and this is really advice for developers. um, I I think this you kind of emphasize like it's pretty important. Like the developer should care about the product. They should have pride in if they were to deliver and like kind of just present the feature to a customer, would they be proud of it? Right, and that's kind of the question you feel like people should be asking themselves. And I think when you painted that picture, I'm like, that's really good advice. I didn't even like I've never done that, and that's really good advice. And to like put yourself in that situation. Um, are you proud of the work that you've done? And sometimes you have to like imagine yourself in that situation. And demo days kind of do it too. It's like demo days kind of hold that accountability. Is like you have things to show. Are you proud of what you've done, or have you gotten anything done, or like what's going on that week? So I think it is a little bit of accountability, but a couple things that you mentioned. So like before, at a previous company, I've had those bouts of like stubborn thinking, and I would even say as far as like arrogance, like how could this be like low quality, and like it was like just patterns of thinking that I would catch myself in, and I'm like, why am I thinking like this? And one thing I realized, there were a couple things. Um, when I have floating requirements, that's something that frustrates me. And so as a developer, I have to do it. Like, this is one thing I struggle with. I have, like, this is still something to the point where like I quit Catalytic, where I was still trying to improve on this. I have to do a better job at like asking, like if I even have like a weird thought in my head that doesn't align with what and make sense of what they're telling me, like ask those questions, get those requirements solidified as early as possible, because I kind of went into, it was a weird situation with the previous company, but like kind of went into like getting work passed off to me, and I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't solidify, really my role in delivering the feature. Like there were a lot of mistakes I made, and then at the end, I kind of found myself thinking like, I worked my ass off. I put a lot of hours in, and um, like it's still like the quality or like what was supposed to be delivered wasn't like acceptable, and I had to kind of like, at first I would challenge it, I would kind of make excuses, and then like talking through that a little bit more, and when I put those emotions aside, I'm like, okay, I could have asked more requirements early in the beginning. I could have gotten QA involved earlier in the beginning, and like as that went on, I've learned that, but it's very easy for when you are working, like you said, when you're working your butt off and you put a lot of energy into something, and for like someone just to say nope, not good enough, it's like, well shit. It's a very defeating thing to hear, and you kind of have to like, you really have to challenge yourself to be humble about it, and it's a very hard thing to do. So I think it's great that you recognize that sometimes developers are just like overworked, and it's the process in which they got to that point that could be improved. It's not their work ethic, it's not like the effort they put in. It's really like redefining the process, and I think like Catalytic was really good with it, with this. Like a good company will always like challenge the process. They'll always like have those retros, and you could talk about like why this feature wasn't delivered on time, and like I think a good product manager, whoever your boss is, they need to be open to like how to make it easier for you. And I think one of the hardest things was like when you suggest, sometimes you will under deliver on a project, and I think it's important to realize like you probably worked your butt off, you probably did a good job, you're just going to continue improving as a developer. It's going to take a while, you're going to continue to build better habits over the years. Like please don't take that personally, because I definitely did. But just welcome the feedback, be open to process changes, because often you can make drastic changes in a developer's productivity and how others perceive you by just changing the way that you like make sure that you thoroughly understand a feature, and you help like the discovery and the implementation, and kind of plan all of that out. Like honestly, it's going to take years to really build up really good habits as a developer to be able to do that effectively. And at the end of the road, like I've barely met mid-level and senior developers that take things too personally, where like they can't improve. It's usually junior developers or like mid-level developers that have had, or like mid-level and senior developers that have had really bad experiences and haven't overcame them, that like they struggle with taking that feedback. So I would expect I would expect juniors to kind of go through that a little bit more. But I'm just saying, like, I wanted to share this because this is something that, like, this was my struggle. It wasn't technically, it wasn't like what I understood or what I had to learn or pick up. I generally picked up things pretty fast. But it was more of like understanding that I do have a team to back me. It's okay to have other developers come in to push out that feature. And it's completely fine to get help. In fact, they're going to grow a lot more. Your manager is going to appreciate the effort that you're putting in and the communication you're delivering by even just asking for help, rather than being the developer that just sits there and 3 months later, here's what I have. It's not really what we have. Like, you don't want to be in that situation. So I just want to share my experience with that, because that's kind of a hard thing that can take, sometimes people get it right away, and sometimes it could take a little bit longer. Like I said, that's still something I'm trying to improve with. But um, yeah, you got me ranting. Like that's it's exactly what I was thinking about it when you were kind of talking that out. It's really good
Yeah, and
advice.
one thing I wanted to add is I've been in situations where it was frustrating because well, it was frustrating for me because I care about the end quality, but something was not passing my quality standards, and it was not the developer's fault. It was like maybe in this case, it was like they were using a library. The library was just not a very good library. Had its own flaws, and but um, this goes into like a broader topic of like when you're pushing out these features. The reason why you're pushing out these features is to align with company goals,
Mm-hmm.
and our company goals at the time were to just push these something quick and fast, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but we can iterate on it. So um, like this feature like just was using this bad library that wasn't that great, but it met our company goals, and so we pushed it out. So there's like situations like that, and there's also cases where like where me and the developer like went back and forth, and sometimes we couldn't come to a conclusion or like a consensus, and so or we just had concerns, like we both had concerns or questions, and at that point like that's a good time to bring in a third party, which it's usually like the product manager or the project manager who or an engineering manager. It really depends on your organization, but they'll come in and say like, okay, like this, I see what you guys are both saying, and then they'll usually be the one that owns the direction that you should take. Sometimes QA will be like overly zealous and think have a scenario that's not passing. Like for example, like I don't know, like if you're QAing a vending machine and all the core scenarios are passing. Like you push a button and you get your soda. It takes your money. All the core scenarios are passing. But if you push like I don't know a bazillion buttons all at once, like nothing happens or like you don't get your soda. Like that's like a that's like a risk management, and like that's usually on the project manager, the to handle that risk. Um, but and that also goes back to having solid requirements, like if that usually in those scenarios like that wasn't in the requirements, so 9 times out of 10 that feature would be pushed out to production, and it might be hot fixed later. It's really up to your organization on like the quality standards. Like if you really want it to be perfect with no bugs whatsoever, you wouldn't push that feature out. And that's all risk management. Um, but even getting to the point, you just have to getting to that point, you need to like have good communication.
Yeah, it really keeps tying back to communication. And I like what you had mentioned. If you guys are stuck, you can't agree, or you just like the reason you can't agree is because you still have open-ended questions that neither of you can kind of like either get an answer to yet or agree on an answer. Like go to a single source of truth at that point, and there should be like every company should have that single source of truth. I do think that chain of command is helpful for situations like that. And hopefully that person is very knowledgeable, understands the product, and can help you with that. So so we talked about like a lot of ways how to like expectations of a developer, and kind of like what they should be looking out for, and expectations from QA, and we talked about like how communication was important and how quality is important. How do we define quality? So how I guess like I kind of want to like summarize the quality thing with this. How would you determine, like, what metric do you use to determine if a developer is like actually producing a quality feature? Like, it's kind of like a weird question to ask, and I'm not. Hopefully, you kind of understand where I'm coming from. If you need me
Hmm.
to reword it, let me know. But yeah, what would that metric be? What are you looking for to determine that the developer is producing enough quality for you?
Yeah. I think the single most, like the one that's easiest to get and produce and um, is like it is after this feature is put out, like how many problems come back. Like, okay, you release this feature, but someone found 5 bugs and reported 5 bugs, and those were features that you owned. That's one metric. Um, I think another one that's like a little bit different. How many like QA will QA a feature, send it back to the developer. Developer might make some changes, send it back to QA. Ideally, you only want to do that like once or twice.
Okay.
You don't want to do it more than that. If it's more than that, it's usually indicative of a problem. So that's like a lot of companies will measure that, like how many times um, things get passed between QA and development. Um, it can be really important for some companies. McDonald's, it was very important because their QA team was overseas in a different time zone, and
Mm,
developers were in the US. So there it was a time thing, a resource management thing. So they had to push out features. QA would QA them, and then developers would have to make their changes. And if they have to send it back to the QA team, it's like another day that's wasted. So um, that's another metric. I don't remember what that's called exactly. There's probably some official term. Um, uh, let's see. I would say like the number of tests written as like another common like metric, like how many unit tests you're writing before you hand it off to QA.
or like
Is
test
it's not,
coverage, like you can gather
yeah,
that percentage of a code. Yeah.
yep. That's a very good metric. Um, I think those three are usually like those three can be adapted to most organizations and
Hmm.
usually telling of like how good a feature is quality wise. Um, and it really depends on your product too. There could be other metrics in there.
That's true. That's true. So we talked about. You mentioned three metrics, basically, like how many times it's sent back to Q&A. I didn't even realize that's something that some companies measured, which is really interesting. And then number of bugs, I think that's like one of the more common ones too. So, like, I think that's kind of the metric that like would really catch my attention and how I would measure the quality of a feature that I produced. I do think that's really important. And that's kind of why QA doesn't really, doesn't accept these odd cases. Like you said, some developers are like, it's never going to be experienced, but it still is a bug, and it's still it needs to be accounted for because, in my experience, when I always thought it wouldn't be accounted for, some user found it. They found it. I don't know how they
Yeah,
found it.
and some organizations, uh, Catalytic kind of did this. Like when the bug was found, it was the developer that was responsible for that feature that fixed the bug. So I know like our developers really like QA because like it was less bugs that they would have to fix, So it's ultimately like less work for you down the road because it's more expensive to fix a bug in production than if you were to fix it before you.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that accountability. That was is actually something a little bit new at Catalytic. With other companies, developer had some free time, wasn't his feature, wasn't his bug, they just tackled it. We would have teams, so we'd have like 3 people that would be working on like a certain part of the product, and um, but I do like that accountability that Catalytic brought. I thought that was healthy. So sometimes there will be a little back and forth. Sometimes your feature does get rejected. Especially, it's going to happen more often than not when you're joining a new company or you're just a newer developer. It happens as senior developers. I've seen senior developers get their stuff rejected as well. So what, like, that can be a smooth process, right? That can We can make it so that's not a big deal, and the developer kind of just like patches things up and makes like it does ensure that the quality is there. Like, what kind of a communication are you looking for when you do have to send something back? Like, what would you expect from that developer at that point?
Yeah. Um, so I think it's a two-way street. Like QA has to clearly communicate that, okay, this I'm sending this back, and this is why. It's because it isn't passing this scenario. And if this scenario doesn't pass, that means like when the user isn't able to use like this part of the feature. Usually test cases are written like that. They have a scenario, how you executed it, and what the expected result was. So that's on QA to communicate that. And then developers should fix, well, obviously they should fix it. And they should also run tests after they fix it. They shouldn't just fix it and then send it back. They should fix it, test it themselves, and then send it back. And it's also very helpful to write some notes in like how they fix it. It's not always necessary, but it's like nice sometimes, depending on like how knowledgeable QA is of the code. It might be helpful for QA. Um, yeah, but like the main thing is like you're communicating that you actually retest after you fix whatever QA sent back, and then using some sort of format, consistent format to do this. I know a lot of companies, they just do this over spreadsheets or Google Docs or something. They'll just have a Google Doc of like scenarios that are passing and failing. So that's one way to do it. Some people using Airtable or Trello board, like whatever method you use, like stay consistent with it. Um, and also having like estimates of like when it will be ready for QA again is nice. That's not always possible, but it's nice for QA for when they need to plan things, because you got to understand like QA has other things on their plate too,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
the when something gets sent back, it like throws off the timetable for everything else. Um, so having estimates for when something is going to be ready for QA again is really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I was spoiled with sending things back because I had QA that just responds very quickly. I've never worked with QA that would just like. I think like the best communication I've had was usually with QA as far as like roles go. But like it makes it seem like you guys are super efficient that you can just test it again. But I think that communication is important. And like even talked about, I think a lot of QA, if they've been there a while, especially, and they've had a lot of talks with developers, and they've been in potentially like implementation meetings even. Uh, I think like for an example, if I had like I think I had like it was at a previous company, but I had a user authentication issue, and we had like 2 different storages of like users, but like one storage of a user had like all the details of a user, and the other one had like kind of like weird quirky details about a user. And I was using the wrong storage, and it fixed the bug that I had created, but it also like I had to pass that data into other components, and it broke those components. I didn't even realize it. So like when I even like before I finally handed it to QA, she pointed it out, and I basically had to take the feature back one more time. Like, ah, crap, I broke some other things about it. Like, that's where tests are handy. But yeah, like QA has a lot more knowledge than I think a lot of developers expect, and even just talking through how you fixed it is very helpful. It helped me. It saved both of us time. So I thought that was another good piece of advice. Honestly, like I think you've given a lot of really good advice, and more importantly, because you shared like a QA's perspective on it. It's always good to like, especially for a developer, to hear another role's perspective. Um, Quite frankly, I had nothing but good experiences with QA at first. Like, it took rejection hard, but QA have been like crucial roles at helping me become successful as a developer and deliver features. Um, and some developers have to be their own QA, and it's a good thing and a bad thing, but I think it is helpful to have people that are dedicated and that understand the entire product and how everything kind of mingles together. But I loved hearing your perspective, Kevin. Seriously, it was very helpful. If you had to leave a developer that's going to be working with QA in the future, well, like one piece of final advice, what would it be?
Um, well, I guess like one thing would be just like understand quality, like what quality means. And also like understand, like have a better understanding of like the development life cycle. Like there's development and then there's QA and then the end of the project. And QA is at the very tail end of that. So if you look at that, like QA, like a lot, it really depends on the organization, but sometimes that time is finite because they're at the tail end of the life cycle. So they might want to test all these things, but like they just can't because of constraints. So if you take that in perspective and like do the due diligence beforehand, then like it'll really help QA out, it'll help you out, and it'll help the organization out.
Yeah, yeah. I th- hopefully a lot of developers like really take that seriously. I'm gonna phrase this a little bit differently, and what you just said might apply to it. If you have a brand new developer, first job, first month into the position, what would be your advice for them in
Um,
terms of quality and just interacting with QA?
yeah, I would come in with a learning mindset. Um, you don't have all the answers. Expect to break a lot of things. Expect to like breaking things is good. It's fine. I mean, it's good to break. It's good when someone finds something you broke because it's better that someone else found it in your organization than a customer. So come in with like an open mindset. Um, and just learn from your mistakes, and learn from like whatever like QA has to like they're the ones thinking of these like crazy scenarios. So like if you take a page from their book, you can like code for those scenarios ahead of time. It just makes you a better developer, right? Um, so but you have to have the right learning mindset for that. So I think that's what I would say.
I love it. I think that's really, really good, encouraging advice. I think you even had a shirt at one point like "I break things every day," or that was like your phrase on Slack.
Yep.
Um, yeah, I love that. That was that was really good. Kevin, thanks so much for sharing your perspective. Again, I think you were one of my favorite people to work with in QA. You're very likable. Like I said, I think you gave a lot of good advice. Hopefully, it's going to help a lot of good developers. So thanks for being on today, and yeah, thanks for chatting.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was fun.